when you think about it, just the data points, like the U.S. accounts for a quarter of foreign investment in Australia. It's the top destination for Australian foreign investment abroad. You have a $2.2 trillion relationship. It's fundamental to Australia. I mean, you can argue that it's Australia's most important economic relationship. The Chinese trade relationship is 4 times that of the U.S. The U.S. investment relationship with Australia is 13 times that with China.
Yeah, right.
It's massive.
Have one for mum, one for dad, one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. A banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and when the United States-Australia partnership is in the news, you might have noticed that it's normally in the context of defence, like the discussion we're currently having around the AUKUS agreement.
The government has announced that more than $3 billion will be spent on long-range missiles, Tomahawks, and high-mobility artillery rocket systems from the United States.
Increases our military capability, and that increases our ability to deter conflict.
Joe Biden signing a defence deal with Australia as the summit leaders head out of China.
AUKUS, that's the pact between Australia, the US and the UK, and it's designed to give nuclear submarine technology to Australia, but...
I'm scared that a world with more nuclear power is a more dangerous world.
This is about American power in the Pacific and Asia, not about security for Australians.
The relationship between the United States and Australia is a very special one, a very unique one. And it's not just grounded on security or economic issues. It's grounded on values and principles that we share in common.
But the reality is our economic relationship gets far less attention. And to rectify this, a recent report by Joey Herlihy, a research intern here at the Australia Institute in our International and Security Affairs program, who's visiting us from Georgetown University, looked at this economic relationship in a lot more detail. So I'm going to chat to him about that today. G'day, Joey.
Hi, Ev.
So you've written this report about the economic relationship between the US and Australia. Why did you pick this to kind of dive into?
Well, I think that, and this is a credit to Alan Beam, obviously the director of the program, who brought me here and just off of literally a simple email. But it's a credit to him that he chose to have me research the economic relationship, because we both agree that that relationship is foundational. It's a cornerstone of the broader Australia-America relationship. And like you said, people talk about the security relationship, the defense relationship, basically all the time. And you never really hear a ton about just how important the economic relationship is. And Alan will make the argument that it may be the most important part of the relationship. And I think that my paper just contributing to the fact that it's a cornerstone of the relationship, and many people misunderstand it in favor of focusing on, like you said, the defense relationship.
Yeah. I guess we are having kind of a national conversation about the AUKUS agreement and things like that at the moment, whereas the economic relationship is kind of just always, chugging along in the background there. But you kind of go back through the history of the relationship as well. So how foundational is the economic partnership between Australia and the United States?
Well, I think that it was really cool looking at the history first things first. I think that, at least per my knowledge about what I've done, this is probably the first study that looks all the way through the First Fleet till now, and even to the future. So again, it began as a simple just landowning relationship, unfortunately, from 2 African-American slaves that came here. But it's expanded, obviously, $2 trillion relationship. And just how foundational it is, I think, it is one of the cornerstones of the relationship, because you talk about a two-way investment relationship worth over 2.1 trillion Australian dollars. And I'm just going to say dollars from now on because we're in Australia. A bilateral trade relationship worth 76 billion. And that's just in dollar figures. If you put it in GDP, I mean, in 2019, Australian exports to the U.S. and income from American investment here in Australia financed Australia's gap between savings and investment. And I mean, that was 7% of GDP. Savings and investment, the gap is about 5%. So there's still 2% more there. So if you really think about it that way, I mean, this is crucial to Australia. And in terms of broader partnership, I think it's foundational because what I argue in the paper too is that the FTA really linked America and Australia in ways that nothing else really did before besides that defense relationship. Like, it is part of the broader defense relationship. Howard, when he negotiated it, said the same thing. I mean, George W. Bush, Robert Zoellick too, they said the same thing, that it really is part of this broader relationship. And I think that had it not existed, you wouldn't have seen Australia survive a lot of the Trump administration tariffs and protectionism.
I want you to just put it into a bit of that broader context for me. How has it kind of evolved over time?
Oh, man. I mean, we talk about a relationship that started with two men, later Billy Blue, and had turned into one of whaling, where British whalers and American whalers collaborated off the coast of also New South Wales, but also Western Australia there in Fremantle. We talked about mining, how it evolved from two men to whaling to mining. In the gold rushes, Australians went over to the U.S., Americans came over to Australia to mine, try to get rich, make a fortune. And then from there, as Australia started to turn from Britain in World War II, specifically in 1942, after the fall of Singapore, away from Britain, you really started to see a development that evolved from something that was there to something massive. I mean, I think that my research in the last half of the 20th century, Australian foreign investment in the U.S. went from 1% of Australian foreign investment abroad to over 40%. I mean, that jump that's evolution at its finest. And the share of U.S. investment in Australia doubled from 16 to 32. And then post FTA, you see the investment relationship has grown, I mean, over 4 times, I would say almost 4 times since like 2004, before the FTA. So evolving over time, you look at something from simple landowning to agricultural exports, capital goods imports, to now service exports, to now mineral exports, which I talk about the negative impacts of that too. And it's something that is much more liberalized, and it's something that is a lot more institutionalized than it was before.
Strong business ties between Australia and the US make sense, and in fact have been part of the Australia-US story for over 2 centuries. Since Ausford's inception, two-way trade between the US and Australia has doubled, and two-way investment between Australia and the US has almost tripled to $1.3 trillion, a remarkable achievement.
So you've kind of mentioned a range of areas where that relationship has grown a huge amount. Are you expecting that to continue into the future? What are some areas where, do you think it will continue to evolve, I guess, from here?
Yeah, I think it will continue to evolve. And it's what we've seen since 1950 right? In the last 75-ish years, it's what we've seen. But I think it will continue to evolve, especially, and maybe unfortunately, in the mining area. Although that, is committed to Australia being the 3rd largest exporter of fossil fuels, climate pollution, and the U.S. is no small player in that.
Yeah.
I think that will be one partnership that's big, because you talk about industrial policy in the U.S., the CHIPS Act, the IRA. These are stated desires to secure critical minerals.
So for Australians who don't know what those are, what's the CHIPS Act?
CHIPS Act is the Chips and Science Act of 2022. It's basically U.S. industrial policy about $280 billion to build up the U.S. chip making capacity, because we're now in a time of geopolitical competition between the U.S. and China, and the U.S. feels a need to secure their own chip making capacity. In the IRA.
Well, plus we had a worldwide chip shortage, didn't we?
Oh my goodness. So you think about all those things now, and that has to be taken into account, right?
Massive worldwide chip shortage.
If you don't have these chips, we're in trouble.
There's a big problem with computer chips right now. There's just not enough of them to go around.
Turns out one company makes 24% of all the world's chips.
We've heard a lot about the U.S. CHIPS Act.
This week marked a major step forward in the government's push to bring more semiconductor manufacturing capabilities to the U.S.
The U.S. to be making chips, semiconductors here in the U.S., not so much abroad.
And the IRA is the Inflation Reduction Act. Same thing, it provides credits to companies doing business with the U.S. and giving their critical minerals to the U.S. So I think that minerals will be one section in which it's going to evolve. But I think that perhaps a little bit of a lighter and more environmentally friendly area where it will evolve is, I talk about it briefly in the paper, but Australian superannuation funds.
Mm-hmm.
So Australia has a pool of about $2.7 trillion Australian dollars in super funds. about 550 billion of that is invested in the U.S.
Wow.
Right? So you have nearly 20% of it invested in the U.S. And that basically finances a lot of U.S. industrial projects, roads, airports, ports, pipelines, whatever it may be. And the U.S. does not have that same super fund.
Mm-hmm.
What we do have is portfolio investment that largely comes from private companies, kind of like a super fund, but we don't have that same super fund. And I think that there's a space there where the U.S. could do something similar to Australia and keep building that relationship, because the U.S. is the largest portfolio investor in Australia at about 620 billion.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's an area where it'll probably evolve.
Yeah, right. And I want to come back to the free trade agreement, because that was quite controversial here in Australia at the time. And you kind of mentioned it's not really a free trade agreement.
Not at all. Not at all.
If it was, you probably wouldn't need as many rainforests mown down to produce the act that enforced it all. But yeah, tell me a little bit more about the FTA.
So it's labeled an FTA by label. So what's different on paper is different in reality, right? So it's really a PTA, a preferential trade agreement, in that it's about securing preferential access to each other's markets. So you think about the Foreign Investment Review Board here in Australia increasing their threshold for reviewing U.S. foreign investment from about $50 billion to $800 billion, which is now over $1 billion, right? So that secures preferential access for the U.S. by giving them a much bigger threshold for general investment. You talk about market access. So 97% of Australian non-agricultural exports are now tariff-free into the U.S., excluding textiles, which is important, and about 75% of agricultural imports. And another reason why it might have been controversial is because today about 100% of U.S. exports are entering Australia tariff-free. About 96% of Australian exports are importing the U.S. tariff-free. And that 4% is pretty important because one of those exports is sugar. And the U.S. sugar market is heavily subsidized. And that was one of the biggest sticklers in the FTA, especially from an Australian perspective. And so it's not really an even agreement in that sense, but it is preferential in that it's about giving both countries increased access at the expense of other countries, because that's really what PTAs do. And I think another reason why it might have been controversial is because it's not multilateral, right? It's a PTA. It's not really free trade. And you also talk about an Australian government who wants and has for the decades before the Howard government talked about using the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, right, to provide affordable medicines to all Australians. And U.S. negotiators saw that as a barrier to trade.
Yeah. Not well known for your cheap medicines in
the
United States.
Not at all. I mean, we talk about like a country that we pay $1,000 for healthcare, and I've had experiences where I could not get some medicines just because they were expensive, and come from a pretty wealthy background relatively to the rest of the country, right? So that PBS was a big point, because you can really make the argument, and many people have, that the Australian government decided to prioritize getting a FTA, which is really PTA, with the U.S. at the expense of supporting their consumers and their pharmaceutical industry to actually provide affordable medicines to everybody.
But the net result was, as you mentioned, that despite some of those controversies, really we have seen trade between the two countries grow very fast.
Yeah, I think we have. I mean, in absolute dollars for sure. I mean, it more than doubled from before, around $30 billion to $76.5 billion in two-way trade. Investment was probably the most important one. I think I've heard somebody quoted saying that trade is like dating, investment is like marriage. Like you went from nearly quadruple in the absolute value of investment. I think that on the whole, it's significantly expanded, and to draw two economies closer together, the largest economy and the 13th largest economy in the world, who both happen to be democracies, who both happen to share interests. I mean, we really are pretty two countries tied close together. And so I think that on the whole, the FTA is really argued, and as I argued in my paper, to have done more good than harm for Australia. But those agreements that did more harm than good, those arguments that did more harm than good, are really, really important.
I believe there are good free trade agreements and there are bad free trade agreements. I believe the proposed United States-Australia free trade agreement is a good free trade agreement.
That we're going to have an even better future in this region by generating the kind of economic dynamism that we can all hope to see.
FTA between Australia and the US, so here to discuss that, the TPP, lots of...
Well, the TPP is obviously far bigger than the bilateral one that we've had going on now for 10 years with Australia.
Is there any threats on the horizon to this economic partnership?
100%. So a little bit of background. In 2017, when President Donald Trump took office in the U.S., he had stated, and so did Hillary Clinton, that he was going to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a multilateral free trade agreement between the U.S., Australia, and I think about 9 other Asia-Pacific countries, intended to catalyze trade between the Asia-Pacific countries. It would have accounted for about 40% of global trade. So it would have been, if not the largest, one of the largest trade agreements in the world.
We support free trade. We cannot have free and open trade if some countries exploit the system at the expense of others.
And the U.S. withdrew because they wanted to maintain their own protectionist interests, such as snapback provisions.
What's a snapback provision?
So basically what it is that it allows American companies, once they, say, export a good and it's not at the right price, it's not in their own interest, the U.S. can snap back the subsidies on that good in order to give American companies, I would say, a bigger advantage in their international market because their prices are lower because they're subsidized by the government.
Yeah.
And so that allows, like I said, it's a protectionist interest, right, to help American domestic companies. And so the U.S. under Donald Trump withdrew from that agreement. What that showed Australia was that the U.S. was not committed to multilateral trade, right? They still pushed for IP, so intellectual property protections, think like copyright.
Mm-hmm.
They still pushed for those with Australia, while at the same time negotiating a separate trilateral PTA again with Mexico and Canada. So it showed Australia that, man, our interests may really have diverged from the U.S. because under Howard, they valued bilateral PTAs. And we saw an expansion of that under the Kevin Rudd and the Gillard governments, now the Albanese government. We saw a return to multilateralism. And whereas Australia is trying to go more free trade multilateral, the U.S. is now going more industrial policy protectionist. And so in 2017, Australia saw, man, our interests might really have split. And when, like I said, the CHIPS Act and the IRA, money to build industrial capability in the U.S., when those came out in 2022, Australia finally realized, fearfully, by the way, that our interests have split. One of us is doing protectionism. The other one of us is doing free trade.
So when you say fearfully, why is that? Because
the Australia-America relationship is so institutionalized, it's so deep. And when you think about it, just the data points, like the U.S. accounts for a quarter of foreign investment in Australia. It's the top destination for Australian foreign investment abroad. You have a $2.2 trillion relationship. It's fundamental to Australia. I mean, you can argue that it's Australia's most important economic relationship. The Chinese trade relationship is 4 times that of the U.S. The U.S. investment relationship with Australia is 13 times that with China.
Yeah, right.
It's massive. And like I said, it financed the gap in 2019 between savings and investment. Like, not many countries can say that. And what that policy does is it risks disrupting in a severe way that economic relationship because the U.S. is more concerned with building their own domestic capabilities than looking to trusted, by the way, and I use trusted because Australia is a trusted partner. I mean, we're sharing nuclear codes with Australia, right? It values protecting and growing American industry at the expense of working with other countries.
That's obviously a lot more to do with domestic politics than anything else, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, you see the Biden administration continuation of Trump's policy, and they've just named it a new thing called foreign and economic policy for the middle class, which again is just protectionism to help your middle class to win votes, because that's what it is in the U.S. They're playing politics. But again, that comes at the expense of really supporting free trade. Like, Australian companies may not be eligible for tax credits in the IRA because, in the simple terms, Australian companies process a lot of their critical minerals like lithium in China. And the U.S. won't allow for a certain percentage of those minerals to be processed in China in order to get those credits. So Whereas you had a mining partnership that's pretty valuable that may be severely disrupted, that could fracture a lot because of these new stipulations about processing within the U.S. And so I think it is fearful because you have domestic politics trying to win votes at the expense of supporting a relationship that you've had since 1788.
Australia's free trade agreements continue to provide new opportunities for Australian businesses. The Australian government has now signed the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, also known as the TPP-11.
So I guess that brings us to kind of, the geoeconomic and geopolitical effects of this kind of a relationship. What are we looking at in the near future? You've just talked about some of those potential disruptions. What's the outlook look like?
Well, I think for the U.S. side, it's pretty simple. It's war with China, hopefully not militarily, but certainly economically. For Australia, which is what this paper is focusing on, is really a different story. Australia is now almost faced with a choice between the U.S. and China in terms of economic cooperation, because U.S. industrial policy says
it's forcing a choice.
You work with us or you don't get any help from us.
Yeah.
And so now you have Australia, who's joined, by the way, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that China was a chief signatory towards. It's joined the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, something along the lines. What evolved from multilateralism with the U.S. is now multilateralism with China, who joined the CPTPP. So industrial policy is really forcing upon Australia the choice of the U.S. or China in terms of economic cooperation. And on top of that, you look at our relationship with the U.S. that I said before could be fractured because of U.S. industrial policy. So toward the future, Australia is in a tough situation right now where their relationship with the U.S., as I've argued, is the most important economic relationship for Australia. But they're almost being forced to choose between that or with China. And China's Australia's most important trading partner. China's right in their backyard. The U.S. is too, but it's not as close. And it's really a threatening thing for Australia. It's a frightening thing. And it's, in my opinion, probably an unfair choice that Australia has to have. So the future of that relationship depends on whether the U.S. will turn back to multilateralism.
It's quite a contrast to we're getting closer militarily, and it sounds like potentially further apart economically.
I think for sure. I mean, there was that quote I remember one former Australian leader, prime minister, said, "Yeah, we don't have to choose." The policy has been we don't need to choose between the U.S. or China. We can have the U.S. as their security partner and China as their economic partner. And both China and the U.S., to be fair, are saying you don't have that choice.
Yeah.
But U.S. industrial policy is probably saying that in an indirect way. I don't know what the talks are between Canberra and Washington. They're probably a little more direct than that. But they're saying that you choose us or them. And it is drawing closer security-wise and maybe even further economic-wise, because with AUKUS, you've chosen the U.S. as your security partner. The question is that more important, not only for U.S. global leadership, but for the Australia-U.S. partnership? Is that more important than having China join on one multilateral agreement and possibly a second and drawing Australia's economy closer to China's? What's more important, nuclear submarines or drawing some of the world's most dynamic economies important together? I think it's probably the latter. Australia probably thinks the latter too.
Yeah, well, I mean, we didn't even know we needed nuclear submarines until, a couple of months ago. And I think there'd be many people that still argue, shouldn't be a huge priority for Australia's defence either.
We have to bring our defence capabilities up to speed, and AUKUS is central to that.
To think that 2 or at most 3 nuclear-powered submarines would change the course of a war is, I think, a huge leap in faith and simply not credible.
So what would you want people to take home from this paper?
I think there's a few things. I think the first thing is that the economic relationship kind of flies under the radar, if that's a right analogy. It's massive. I mean, it's massive. I'm not saying that one aspect of the broad relationship is more important than another, but you could really make the argument that the economic partnership is the foundation of that agreement, because I think what's the Clausewitz quote? Like, war is just monetary policy continued by other means or something along those lines. Like classic one, you need an economy to fund a military. But it's a massive partnership. It's worth $2.2 trillion. It's employing, I think, over 470,000 people, both in the U.S. and Australia. I mean, again, it financed Australia's gap between savings and investment. It's grown from something in the first fleet to something now that's most important everything. U.S. is the top investor in Australia, top destination for foreign investment. Like, it links both countries in a way that the FTA did, and even more so now because, like my paper is called, like, money talks. You know, at the end of the day, money talks. You need money to do things. And whether that's right or not, you know, I'm not, let's leave that to the side. The fact of the matter is that you need money to do things. And this is a crucial relationship. And so I think that I want people to just understand the scale of it. And at the same time, I want people to understand that that scale has major questions and concerns. Like, that scale comes at the expense of harming the environment with mining, giving American companies tremendous influence in Australia, you know, harming the PBS. I'm going to use the word harm because prices are more expensive now. You know, it goes from, it's a PTA, it's not an FTA, right? So it comes with serious concerns. And now you look to the future, this crucial partnership is in jeopardy because the U.S. wants to protect its domestic interest, right? So my paper, I hope, shows just how important the relationship is, but also because of that importance, just how bad it would be if Australian concerns that are now the reality progress even further to fracture the relationship.
Well, lots to unpack in that, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Ev. I appreciate it. It's been a great few months here.
Well, thanks very much, Joey, and it's been an absolute pleasure hosting you here, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Australia.
Thanks, Ev. I appreciate it.
This episode was recorded on Thursday, the 3rd of August 2023, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, including Joey's report, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _N_T, and our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.